everybody. Thank you for coming out on this lovely, lovely day. This is our second Humanities Colloquium of the year and of ever. And we will be doing this regularly as NDSU transforms and changes. Some things are too good to change, and one of those things is the power of the humanities in our community and on our campus. So I'm proud to welcome you all here today. This series, still in its infancy, would not at all be possible if it were not for the proprietor of this fantastic bookstore and gift shop, Mr. Greg Dance, who is there back by the door. Hats off, thank you, sir. It's not just a lovely place to shop out front, this is a lovely place to be. This is a room that respects and values books and browsing and intelligent conversation. It's got real wooden floors. It's just an incredible place to be. All right. And the windows even are big enough to let in light, so I'm happy to be here. The other person we need to thank is, of course, Dr. Tom Ezern of the history program, whose idea this round was, or this whole colloquium. So thank you, Tom. And he's been assisted in organizational things by many people, including the disappearing Heath Wing, on other fronts, and Dr. Suzanne Kelly also. Okay, well, it's my job to introduce our presentation and the presenters today. You are about to hear a tag team presentation called Books Across Borders, The Lives and Adventures of Joaquín Murieta. This is based in work, interdisciplinary work that these two colleagues of mine do, and it comes out of, I don't know, we'll just call it the craziness that was mid-19th century California, with all that might invoke for you. The two speakers today will be Dr. Amy Gore, to my left, who is Assistant Professor of English. Dr. Gore is a book historian and a scholar of American literary history. She earned her PhD in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 2019 at the University of New Mexico. And she has a forthcoming monograph which is entitled Book Anatomy, Body Politics and Materiality in Indigenous Book History. The other presenter today is Dr. Heath Wing. Dr. Wing is an associate professor of Spanish. He specializes in Latin American literatures and is also a literary translator of some repute from Spanish and Portuguese. And he earned his PhD in 2015 from Texas Tech University, which is somewhere 20 miles due west of Rawls, Texas. All right. So with no further ado, Drs. Gore and Wing.
Thank you. I'm honored to be invited to speak at one of my favorite bookstores, surrounded by stories. And it's my pleasure today to tell you one of the most popular and influential stories in the world. It's a story of theft and a story of power, the story of a headless bandit who never seems to truly die, one whose legend lives on in new forms and new stories transformed over time, including Batman and Zorro. It's a story of books across borders, and it's a story of a man named Joaquín Murieta. And you'll see flashing next to me just a fraction of some of the offshoots of the story that I'm about to tell you. So in August of 1853, a poster appeared in Stockton, California to advertise the town's newest local entertainment. For one day only, as the poster announces, one can be gruesomely titillated by the dismembered body parts of two infamous California bandits. Joaquín Murieta's head and three-fingered Jack's hand, preserved in large jars, had not been easily obtained and pointed to the continuing violence within the newly formed state of California. In previous years, following the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, newspapers began to announce the continual raids and murders committed against local citizenry and blamed a man named Joaquín as the ringleader. Yet the newspapers could not agree. At times, Joaquín had as many as 5 different last names, perhaps representing 5 different men, and he seemed able to commit crimes simultaneously in widely spread geographical locations. The crimes for which Murrieta was accused became so troublesome that on May 11, 1853, the California legislature authorized Captain Harry Love and his group of rangers to capture the elusive Murrieta. After 2 months of searching, Love and his men triumphantly brought a dismembered head and hand that they claimed belonged to the one and only Joaquín Murieta and his lieutenant, Three-Fingered Jack, to the governor in exchange for a substantial monetary reward. The controversially identified body parts then made their way around the state in an attempt to convince California citizens of the re-establishment of law and order. Cherokee writer and expatriate John Roland Ridge came to California in the heyday of the Joaquin legend. After a brief and unsuccessful stint as a lawyer and on the run from a murder he committed, allegedly, in Kansas, Ridge followed the streams of migrants heading to the farmlands and gold mining camps of the coastal state. There, in the heat of the gold rush, he attempted to prosper not with a sluice pan or shovel, but with a pen, publishing poems and articles in local periodicals while picking up work as a newspaper editor. As a man with literary ambitions, Ridge soon turned to the novel and decided to capitalize on the romanticized exploits of Joaquin that had been circulating in regional newspapers. He struck literary gold with his first and only novel, The Life and Adventures of Joaquín Murieta, the celebrated California bandit, published in 1854, same year as Moby Dick, by the way, known today as the first novel published by a Native American and the first novel published in the newly incorporated state of California. The slim, pamphlet-sized book anticipates later dime novels and claims to recount with historical accuracy the events of Murieta's life, from his push into a life of crime to his beheading. The Life and Adventures of Joaquín Murieta inserts readers into the intense violence of mid-19th century California. So here's the plot. The plot begins with a sympathetic portrayal of Murrieta, who enthusiastically crosses the border from his boyhood home in Sonora at the conclusion of the U.S. Mexico War in hopes of becoming an American citizen. He immediately encounters racial prejudice, however, and after a series of brutalities in which Americans rape his mistress, lynch his half-brother, run him off his farm, and whip him, Murrieta turns against his, quote, generous and noble nature and into a life of crime. Because of the similar injustices experienced by other Mexicans in California, a number of men begin to join Murrieta's band and initiate what in fact becomes an organized crime unit with the sadistic Three-Fingered Jack as Murrieta's right-hand man. The bulk of the novel then relays their daring adventures and close encounters with vigilante law as they exact revenge on the America that denied their equality. The novel ends with Murrieta's and Jack's dismemberment at the hands of Captain Love and translate the tragedy of Murrieta's life into a moral lesson. Quote, this is one of the last lines of the book, "There is nothing so dangerous in its consequences as injustice to individuals, whether it arise from prejudice of color or from any other source. That a wrong done to one man is a wrong done to society and to the world." Unquote. So, Murrieta leaves the reader entertained by the bandits' daring exploits, but it rewraps the gratuitous sensationalism into the sober message of tragic injustice. As so many others living in 1850s California experienced, however, Ridge did not find the wealth and success of his dreams, whether through gold or through this book. Instead, he had his property, his profit, and his rights stolen from him. In a letter to his relative Stand Watie, Ridge complains of having been swindled from his profits when his publishers sold 7,000 copies of his book, but then declared bankruptcy and, quote, left me along with 100 others to whistle for our money. 5 years later, Ridge discovers the theft not only of his profits, but also his copyright when a salacious crime magazine, the California Police Gazette, plagiarized his book first in a magazine series and then again as a book without Ridge's consent or byline. Despite Ridge's public outcry, he never received restitution for the copyright theft, and instead, the Gazette plagiarism becomes the most popular and internationally reproduced source of Murrieta's story, ignoring that first edition and going from the stolen edition from then on. As a result, Murrieta has become one of the most internationally appropriated single narratives in literary history, I argue, which now includes what you're seeing on the screen here, just a fraction of them, but novels, films, plays, songs, an epic poem, children's books, believe it or not, despite the beheading stuff, a Soviet rock opera that I found recently, which is really interesting, and the inspiration for both Batman and Zorro. It has also seen translations into numerous languages, including French, Spanish, Russian, Italian, Polish, Turkish, Swedish, German, and Persian. I was able to find those translations. So, unauthorized reprints were common during the 19th century. In the absence of international copyright law, world literature, and especially British literature, could be reprinted in the American literary marketplace without needing to share profits with the author or original publisher, making already successful, commercially successful books, rather than untried American manuscripts, more profitable choice for publication. As a result, unauthorized reprints and uncopyrighted periodicals dominated the American literary marketplace, leading Meredith McGill to describe the era from 1834 to 1853 as the culture of reprinting. By the time Ridge copyrighted Murrieta in 1854, though, the culture of reprinting had shifted due to structural changes in the book trades that began in the early 1850s and the increasing commercial viability of American literature, signaled most definitively by Harriet Beecher Stowe's runaway bestseller, maybe you've heard of it, Uncle Tom's Cabin from 1852. The culture of reprinting changed as literary property became increasingly legislated. Yet in the case of Ridge's Murrieta, a number of conditions make the unauthorized reproductions of his book illegal plagiarisms rather than legal reprints. Murrieta was not a commercially successful British book, which had often been the prime target for an unauthorized reprint. There was no international copyright law. You could take a British book and publish it for complete profit at the time. Instead, Murrieta had been published in the U.S. and had a U.S. copyright, which did have protection under domestic law that earlier native authors, such as Paul Cuffey and William Apess, George Copway, and David Cusick had pursued. Unlike a piracy, the Gazette does not reproduce Ridge's text exactly, so it's not just kind of publishing, throwing it through a press and copying exactly, but it does follow the original plot closely with some additional scenes and details. It does obviously paraphrase Ridge's words and ideas, so much so as to make it likely that the writer would have been looking directly at a copy of Ridge's first edition while plagiarizing. 3 known 19th century printings of Ridge's novel with his byline exist. First edition, published by W.B. Cook in 1854, and then a posthumous edition published by Frederick McCrellish in 1871 and reprinted again in 1874, which advertises a narrative revised and enlarged by the author before his death. Here's the catch. Very few copies of the 1854 edition survived and did not reappear in bibliographical history until the 1930s. No one could find a copy of this first edition, allowing early 20th century scholars to question Ridge's protestations of the novel's plagiarism and to dismiss such claims as unimportant. They said, prove it, we can't find a copy, it's not yours. Yet while no known records exist of any attempt by Ridge to pursue legal action against the Gazette, neither did he give up claims to his book. Although his unexpected death in October 1867 cut short any legal action he might have taken, the second edition of his book includes an enraged author's preface that calls out the unjust plagiarism of his book and claims in this 1871 edition, he claims that edition as, quote, a matter of justice, both to the author and the public, in so much as a spurious edition has been foisted upon unsuspecting publishers and by them circulated to the infringement of the author's copyright and the damage of his literary credit, end quote. Sadly, however, Ridge's attempts at justice were largely ignored in the course of history. After the Gazette's appropriation of Ridge's text, other publishing houses followed suit and republished the plagiarism continuously, without crediting or acknowledging Ridge. It's like it never happened. The number of versions and editions throughout the 20th century remain uncounted. No one's ever tried to account for all the versions that we are showing you here, just a portion of them. But they certainly range in the hundreds, all printed without profit to Ridge or his descendants. While Ridge's original narrative has now lived in public domain for well over 100 years, its original theft remains problematic for contemporary editions, translations, and adaptations that perpetuate that plagiarism without acknowledging its problematic history and crediting Ridge. Despite the ways in which Ridge remains severed from his text, however, his narrative continues to cross literary, temporal, and geographical borders, especially in sites of systemic violence. And so my colleague is going to pick it up from there.
I'd like to thank everyone that came today. I really appreciate it. And my students, it's good to see some of my students here. I'm sure that me offering extra credit has nothing to do with y'all's presence here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the places, or where Joaquín Murieta ended up, which is Chile, all the way down in South America, which interestingly has a tradition of Joaquín Murieta narratives in which the Mexican bandit, is reinterpreted as a Chilean bandit who immigrated to California, as many Chileans did during the gold rush in California, to mine gold, right? One of the big industries in Chile to this day is mining, right? And so when the gold rush hit, Chileans headed north. And to this day, there's a tradition of narratives, multiple novels, including Isabel Allende, who is probably one of the most published Latin American authors to this day. She has a version of Joaquín Murieta. But I'm gonna talk about Pablo Neruda, who wrote an opera about Joaquín Murieta. And I'm going to compare it a little bit to Ridge's novel and the way in which he kind of reinterprets this story. So I'm just going to kind of jump in there. So it should come to no surprise that Ridge's bandit narrative would find many homes south of the border. As scholars have long pointed out, banditry is perhaps one of the most consistently recognizable motifs in Latin American literatures. Banditry resonates from the top to the bottom of Latin American society. Folk traditions such as Jesus Malverde, Paige, she's a former student of mine who wrote a paper, who wrote your honors thesis that was very good about Jesus Malverde. Sorry. So Jesus Malverde in Mexico, as well as the folk saint Gauchito Gil in Argentina, address issues of police violence against and capitalist exploitation of the working class. Whereas bandit narratives also proved foundational to nation-building projects established by letter elites in Latin America. Take, for example, Mexican novels like Los Bandidos del Rio Frío and the very famous novel Los de Abajo, the Venezuelan novel Doña Bárbara, and Argentine works such as Martín Fierro and Juan Morera. The list goes on. So in short, the life of Joaquín Murieta, his death and the subsequent public display of his decapitated head in California were easily transferable via translations to a Latin American readership already familiar with tropes of the genre. Of all the many iterations Murieta would undergo in Latin America, Pablo Neruda's 1966 opera called Fulgor y Muerte de Joaquín Murieta, Splendor and Death of Joaquín Murieta, it was published in 1966, is one of the bandit's more unexpected destinations. Or is it? Now, if one's familiarity with Chilean poet Pablo Neruda is limited to the fact that he was a Nobel laureate who, to this day, is perhaps the most globally read poet in any language, one might wonder why on earth he would write the only opera he ever wrote, based on a piece of U.S. American popular fiction. However, if you are familiar with his anti-colonial and anti-imperial fervor that often permeates his poetry, his poetic realism and devotion to the common working class man in his poetry, then it makes all the sense in the world. After all, in Chile, the working man is, like Murrieta, a miner of ore. So how did Pablo Neruda discover Murrieta? In 1966, it actually came from a visit to the United States when he was giving readings in New York, Washington, and California. While in California, through his acquaintance, Fernando Alegría, a professor and Chilean novelist at Cal Berkeley, and through visits to the Bancroft Library and the Alta California bookstore, the Chilean poet was apparently introduced to Joaquín Murieta and was fascinated by the character. And it seems, I don't know that he was aware of him prior. That's actually something that I can't confirm. Because there were certainly novels written in Chile prior to, well before he ever visited the United States. So we do know that between the pages of some of the books he bought on the trip, Neruda kept articles and drawings of Murrieta, including a clip of the July 30th, 1853 edition of the San Francisco Daily Herald article that announced Joaquín Murrieta's death. While in California, Neruda likewise researched 19th century Chilean immigration to California during the gold rush. Now, in Neruda's version of Murrieta, the Californian bandit is in fact a Chilean immigrant and not Mexican. Interestingly, however, this is not the first work that has the distinction of rewriting Murrieta as Chilean. In fact, the first book to do so was published 100 years earlier in 1867. This book, see if you can follow the line here, attributed to the Chilean Carlos Morla Vicuña, was a Spanish translation of a French translation of the anonymous plagiarized version of Ridge's novel from the newspaper, the California Police Gazette. So Neruda's opera, Splendor and Death of Joaquín Murieta, does have the distinction, at least in Robert McKee Irwin's estimation, and I think this is debatable, but he claims that it is the first work about Murieta that we can identify as truly Latin American. Previous iterations belong to U.S. American and Chicano literatures. Prior to Neruda's work, according to Irwin, the only Latin American tradition related to Murieta were the oral tradition of Sonoran corridos about him, which is a style of folk music and folk poetry. So, Murieta was Chilean, claims Neruda in the foreword to his opera. I have proof. Then, avoiding having to actually provide any evidence, he goes on, but these pages are not concerned with confirming history or validating fantasy. Between the fantasy and history of things, I have interposed my personal identity. In very Nerudian fashion, the poet, by the end of his opera, becomes his working class protagonist, much like he does in various poems found in his Song of Americas, that he published in a collection of poetry from 1950. The ventriloquist act at the end of the opera, where Neruda appropriates Murrieta's voice and speaks through his decapitated head, as I will discuss in a little bit later, allows Neruda to impart truth about his body that meets the political demands of his own time, words that Ridge's Murrieta would have never uttered. But I am getting a little bit ahead of myself. First, I would like to address Murrieta's body in Neruda's opera, or to be precise, the lack thereof. In Neruda's foreword, he introduces the opera's protagonist in the following way. The specter of Joaquín Murieta still rides the California countryside. On moonlit nights, one sees him posting over the prairies of Sonora, spurring a vengeful horse, or he may disappear completely into the solitudes of the Mexican Sierra Madre. This description of Murrieta is likewise how the protagonist is portrayed throughout Neruda's opera. Incorporeal, a specter, a ghost. In fact, the character of Joaquín Murieta is almost completely absent throughout the entire opera. Instead, Murrieta's story is largely told through other characters, the male or female choruses, or through the voice of the poet. Except for Murrieta's talking head at the end of the opera, the only other time he is present is during what's called the lover's dialogue in the opera. This romantic scene takes place on the boat headed for California from Valparaiso, Chile. Yet neither Murrieta nor Teresa, his love interest, are physically present in this scene. Instead, only their voices speak to one another, detached from their bodies. The stage direction indicates that the voice of Murrieta and the voice of Teresa should emanate from a spotlight on the stage. At no time in the opera is Murrieta's body present. In the lovers' dialogue, we have his voice, but no body. Whereas at the end of the opera, his head is present, but Neruda's voice speaks through his mouth. Murrieta is an incorporeal protagonist. His actions are voiced by others. We might even say that his spectral body is formed by the chorus of the multitude of immigrants, laborers, bandits, and marginalized characters in the opera. Murrieta is Legion in Neruda's opera. This is a considerable break from Ridge's Murrieta, who as a protagonist is front and center throughout the novel. Ridge's novel shows what happens when a Mexican man embraces and attempts to put into practice American ideologies like individualism, capitalism, and liberal democracy. In the end, Murrieta's practice of these American ideals only leads to disenfranchisement and the decapitation of his racialized Mexican body. In Neruda's opera, it's entirely contrary to Ridge's novel. The absence of Murrieta's body is the Chilean poet's attempt to compose a new body politic through a multitude of voices. The voices in Neruda's opera, unlike the voice, singular voice, of Ridge's novel, are positioned against U.S. American ideologies and in fact resist them. This is because Neruda's opera, although it takes place during the Gold Rush, it's not about the 19th century United States, but it is instead about Latin America in the 20th century and situated within Cold War politics. Neruda's Murrieta is both the Latin American guerrilla revolutionary of the 1960s and the miners and other laborers that the poet was familiar with in Chile. Their voices are what make up Murrieta's body, and it is their voices that resist U.S. capitalist hegemony. In short, Neruda deploys a vision of a Latin American body politic in the spirit of Cuban poet José Martí's Nuestra América, Our America. It's a very famous essay that this Cuban poet wrote that I actually teach in some of my classes. And in this essay, there is a vision that advocates for a unified America Morena, or a unified brown America. This vision of Latin America is common in Neruda's poetry, and it is often realized through verses in which Neruda, the people's poet, comes in, as he's often called, comes into contact with the common working person of the Americas in unsuspected ways, only to then have his poetic voice subsumed by their identity. Such is the case of his poem Las Alturas de Machu Picchu, The Heights of Machu Picchu, in which the poetic voice, when confronted with the grandeur of the ruins of Machu Picchu, experiences a political awakening as he contemplates the workers that crafted such amazing structures. The poet sees Machu Picchu as a monument to the indigenous laborers who built it, and not that of the Incan monarchy that commissioned it. Upon this realization, the scales fall from the poet's eyes, and he says, I see the servant asleep in the fields. I see a body, 1,000 bodies, a man, 1,000 women, black with rain and night. Let the heart of the forsaken beat in me. I've come to speak through your dead mouths. Much in the same way, Neruda positions the narrative in his opera so that, first, the voices of 1,000 bodies of America Morena tell Murrieta's story, and then, upon his death and beheading, Pablo Neruda will come to speak truth through his dead mouth. In Splendor and Death of Joaquín Murieta, however, there is no monument to the working class. Labor is for the sole purpose of accumulation, of gold in this case. Those performing the labor, Mexicans, Chileans, Native Americans, do so while suffering at the hands of racist Anglo-Americans. Interestingly, their suffering is made worse by what I can only call, for lack of a better term, good old-fashioned American grifting. The antagonists in Neruda's opera are a band of hooded U.S. Americans called bloodhounds. And here I think it's to say that they are the KKK, that they're a stand-in for that. This band of hooded white supremacist vigilantes are led by a man called the Gentleman Swindler, who, when introduced in the opera, is introduced while he's like conning a group of Latinos out of their watches. Right? That's the opening scene of this character. So the same group of bloodhounds we find out are also responsible for the murder and execution of 17 Chileans and 3 Mexican gold miners. Later in the story, the bloodhounds are the ones who rape and murder Teresa, which in his version is Murrieta's wife in his opera. This event is what sets Murrieta on the path of revenge against the hooded white supremacist. This is also the watershed moment that unites all the miners in revolution, with Three-Finger Jack organizing the rebels, saying, "There's no other way for us, Indian, Chilean, Mexican, friends to the end, for better or worse. Saddle up, let's find Murrieta, Joaquín, Joaquín, Joaquín." It is here that Neruda's call to José Martí's vision of America is made most evident, uniting América Morena to take revolutionary action against U.S. ideologies, specifically capitalist exploitation and white supremacy. This is Neruda's stark break with Ridge's narrative, which itself deploys at times racist rhetoric against California's Native Americans. In fact, American ideology is practiced by Ridge's Murrieta to the point of racial violence, represented in the novel when Murrieta and his gang rob and murder a group of Chinese miners and laborers. Commenting on this episode, the scholar Jesse Aleman observes that their demise at the hands of Joaquin and his band marks a moment in the narrative when one alien class attacks another for simple economic gain. In effect, Joaquin's band disposes Chinese laborers much in the same way Anglo-Americans displace Mexican miners and Mexican-American citizens in the narrative. Yet despite the original source for his opera, Neruda idealizes Murrieta and his followers as revolutionaries unified by class and a common enemy. The revolutionary bands of Mexicans, Chileans, and Native Americans soon track down the gentleman swindler, who is revealed to be the grand wizard of the Bloodhounds. Under Jack Three-Finger's orders, they execute him via firing squad and leave him for dead. But he's not dead. After his fellow bloodhounds come across their leader alive, but barely alive, they then extract their revenge on Joaquín Murieta, whom they find visiting Teresa's gravesite, and he is murdered in a subsequent shootout with the bloodhounds. In the next scene, the gentleman swindler enters carrying a cage with Murrieta's decapitated head inside. He is now called the Carnival Barker, and goes about peddling his freak show, barking at the people to come see the genuine Murrieta. This way, folks, for 20 cents, 20 centavos, a modest figure. Not to keep you in suspense, see the head without the tiger. In the final scene of the opera, Murrieta's head speaks, saying, "With no one to hear me, I can speak in the end. A child has died in the shadows, a boy in the dark. He will never know what demanded his death. He will not understand why he moves through a wilderness now." Here Murrieta is finally able to speak, but it is only when no one can hear him, and he seems unsure of what forces caused his death, naive like a child even, as if he doesn't know for what cause he has died. But it is with the help of the poet, through Neruda's voice, that the truth can be known. "The voice I summon is strange," says Murrieta's head. "To whom is it given to know? What intruder or friend, tracing the naked truth in the snow, shall interpret my story or sing it in truth in the end? My time is 100 years hence. My lips shall be Pablo Neruda." The truth that Neruda has access to that Murrieta of the past did not, Ridge's Murrieta perhaps, is the truth of José Martí's America, of América Morena. This is the body politic idealized by Neruda in this opera. It is a body that cannot fit into one man, but bodies whose story is sung by a multitude of voices. As Neruda concludes his opera, "Your people repeat both your song and your grief, like a tolling bell struck underground. The people are million." In conclusion, and it's kind of a quick conclusion here, if Neruda's Splendor and Death of Joaquín Murieta is truly the first literary iteration of Ridge's novel that we can call Latin American, then it is because it taps into the literary tradition in Latin American letters that takes rural peasant violence and banditry of the past and transforms it into modern revolutionary violence and class struggle. Thank you. Okay, yeah. I think
we have time for questions.
Yeah, we'll
so
take questions.
please.
Yeah, we'll both sit here. Daniel.
Yes, thank you. That was really interesting. I have a couple questions. I was wondering if Neruda actually wrote music for this opera, and was it performed? And my second question is, I guess my third. Did he read Ridge's original book? Did he acknowledge it, or was he working off of the Police Gazette? Or was it more of an oral? I'm wondering if he could be accused of plagiarism in his own way, or if he acknowledges Ridge's work.
I'm actually so your first. I'm trying to go back to your first. I'm going to get through your questions. So the first one. What was your first one?
Who wrote the music?
Okay.
Just wrote
To that question, my answer is I don't know. As far as the opera goes, it was performed originally in the 70s in Santiago and at one point in the United States. There is a poster up here. It might appear in a second. We're not going to wait for it. It was performed last year in Santiago, Chile. It was kind of revived in the, if I'm not mistaken, the National Opera House in Santiago, the capital of Chile, is where they have the opera. I have not seen this thing performed. I don't know what it looks like performed. I only have it. I want to find...
It's this one?
Yeah, it's that one, which is actually a really cool poster. So I would love to find a recording of this one that was just performed last year. And then as far as him recognizing Ridge, he doesn't. I'm pretty sure, if I remember right, that was something I paid attention when I first read the opera. As far as his original source, it's fuzzy. I haven't found any. We know he had like notes and things like that. My intuition is he may have actually been. It may have been through the plagiarized Gazette version that he came to know the story. Ridge tends to constantly be kind of left out, the original author, unfortunately. Paige.
Okay, so this is for both of you. This seems like a very masculine story, but a woman plays a very important role in it. So what role does Teresa or his mistress play in the variations of the story and then in the opera? Like, who is she? What does she do? How does she help the story?
I'll jump on that first because actually it's by the Teresa Rosita, whether the female character is named that or the other, that we can trace which version they're following. And so the women are not only important in the plot, but in the book history to trace where they're getting this from. But you're absolutely right, the female characters in this novel are way understudied. I think there's maybe one scholarly article about the importance of the women in this book. Yeah.
As far as the opera goes, she dies. She's murdered pretty quickly, and she doesn't have a big role in the opera. However, Isabel Allende's novel, her version of the Joaquín Murieta story, Carissa, who's the main character of the whole story?
Elisa.
So Elisa in this version of the story is his. Thank you, Carissa. Sorry. Elisa, who is his girlfriend in Isabel Allende's version of the novel, she's the main character. And it's all about her journey from Chile to California under certain circumstances. She dresses like a man to hide her identity and things like that. And it's all about kind of her adventures. And Joaquín Murieta is almost never present in the novel. He kind of appears once he's been decapitated, and she finds his head. So there is Isabel Allende gives us kind of her story. I do not know of other versions that do that.
Yeah.
I have a question. Amy, you mentioned that you found an opera from the Soviet Union about him. It's not Neruda's, is it? Because Neruda was a communist. He was.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
the Soviets would have happily done one of his operas.
Yeah.
It's called The Star of Joaquín Murieta, and I have not seen an English translation. It was actually made into a movie as well as an opera. So I haven't been able to see clips, but maybe I should talk to you about maybe getting access to the language and what it's kind of about. I have found an English language article about the Soviet rock opera that pointed me in the direction of it. That's how I discovered it. And it's really interesting and makes a similar case that Heath and I do about how this novel seems to reappear at times of intense social upheaval across borders, at revolutionary moments, the Cold War, and so here it is again. Yeah.
Can you tell us more about how it gets into Zorro and Batman? Like, how does that
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
You go ahead. You're the book of Zorro.
The kind of version, this becomes a cultural icon that people don't trace back to the original book. And so it was kind of the story morphed into this book that became a film, that became this cartoon figure in Batman, and then became a movie in the 1930s called The Mask of Zorro, and then I think we probably all know the Antonio Banderas version, and so this, it just kind of morphs into popular culture and gets picked up in every single way you can think of.
Yeah, he's the direct inspiration for Zorro, and the way you get to Batman is Bob Kane, who created Batman, on record stated, I got this idea from Zorro. Right? If you think of the story, right, Zorro is this Californiano Hidalgo, right? He's this rich Hidalgo from California who has a large estate, and he goes out at night dressed in black to fight crime. He's this vigilante. And then you get Bruce Wayne, right? Like this rich Gotham City playboy who goes out at night and beats up criminals. Yeah.
Yeah.
So speaking of Californianos, can we talk about like Ridge's view of like people who had been living in California before it was illegally annexed to the United States? It's published in 1854. Right? This is like 5-6 years after the war with Mexico, right? So, I mean, there are a lot of like white people in California who are maybe there as immigrants, right? But when you're describing the story, you talk about Mexicans as being immigrants into California. So how does like Ridge come down on that sort of issue of Mexican-American relations and the end of the war with Mexico?
Ridge's politics are incredibly problematic. So he's part of the Cherokee Nation, who had recently undergone their own civil war that related to the Trail of Tears. There were an elite party of government officials who agreed to the Trail of Tears and the Cherokee Nation and signed that land away and put the rest of their nation through the Trail of Tears. And Ridge's father was one of them. And Ridge's father, when he signed the treaty that gave their land away, said, "I'm signing my own death warrant." And it came true because different members of the Cherokee Nation assassinated him right in front of Ridge, stabbed him to death in front of Ridge and his mother and his family. And so Ridge and his mother go on the run from that. They're outcast themselves from their own nation, never step foot in their own nation again, and go to Kansas. That's where Ridge briefly studies to be a lawyer and then killed a judge. And so I was on the run again to California. And there, his politics are pretty complicated as well, because his novel is pretty racist. He has nothing good to say about Chinamen.
Yeah. And California native folk, he's very
and California
prejudiced.
natives. And he, as a member of the Cherokee Nation, thinks that they're more civilized than California native people. And so this is a very complicated book to teach because it's not all like revolution and
It's not like Neruda's opera at all, right? Yeah,
it's
Neruda
like, well,
idealizes everything.
yeah. It's like, well, we're for this, but these people gotta get in the way. So it doesn't kind of, I mean, I could answer your question further, but I think you get a sense of like how complicated this guy's politics are and the politics of the time.
I've got a question for Amy. What the heck is a book historian, Amy?
There are different kinds. What I'm really interested in is books that materialize social injustice. And so just like when I started tracing copyright, and I talked about that in my presentation, it seems really boring to trace copyright or to trace different titles or different versions. But in fact, it gets me to this really interesting story about theft and power and revolution, and this history of the book leads me to that. Some are more materialist and, you know, kind of assess rare books, like we're in the rare book kind of section in Zambros. But I'm really interested in what tracing these books have to teach us about our society.
I do have a question for both of you guys. How much is the story of Murrieta utilized in a post-colonial settings, given the political nature of the original author?
It is somewhat like...
In Neruda's version,
Yeah.
it's very post-colonial, anti-colonial bent, right? I can't speak to all the different variations, probably as much as you can, of the book. I got really interested in Neruda's opera, and it certainly has that, right? And so that tradition, I feel like, is certainly there in some of these rewritings of his story.
I'd say there's the potential for a political statement to be there, depending on what the author wants to do with it. And we've seen there's such a wide variety of versions. There are some like Neruda who take it as in an anti-colonial stance, and others who make it into a children's book. And like there's no beheading, there's no real bad guys. The outlaw is a good guy and kind of whisks you away into the night and makes it very romantic. So it depends on the author, and it's, I think, really a testament to what happens to this story is that it becomes so malleable. It can be one thing and the other.
Yeah, even there's several westerns, right, which are generally not so post-colonial, right, as a genre, right? And so, in fact, there's one up here that pops up every now and then where he's, and in the early Hollywood westerns with Joaquín Murieta, he's usually a white dude, right? He's not Latino. There's one right there where he's John Murieta now, right? And yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of iterations in ways that he's very malleable, you know. Yeah. Roland. Yeah.
Given the ending of the play, in the sense that the head starts speaking, or Neruda starts speaking through Murrieta, do you see that as he saw himself as you know, a poet Murrieta?
I think so. Yeah. And Neruda, now Pablo Neruda, it's really hard to explain who he is in the context of South America and how. And he was called the people's poet for a reason. He would give readings sometimes at like mining camps, and people would show up, right? Not just that he would go there, but like the workers would, you know, go to hear Pablo Neruda. So he did have this reputation, and he, in his poetry, constantly identified himself with often marginalized subjects like this Joaquín Murieta figure. So Neruda did grow up lower working class in Chile, and yeah, throughout a lot of his career, he also lived in the global South most of his life, including in parts of Asia, and he always identified with poor folk, and so he certainly. Yeah, and he does. This is consistent in his poetry also, where sometimes his lower class subjects that he writes about, you can't distinguish him from them sometimes because their voice is his voice is there. So what he does in the opera is also consistent with what he does in a lot of his poetry.
And one of the famous lines of the book is, "I am Joaquin."
Yeah.
So that translates to just about every version, is the reader can say, "I am Joaquin," and I think Neruda says that as well.
Yeah, and there's the famous Chicano poem called "I Am Joaquin." I don't know, and it, at one point in the poem, it does specifically reference Murrieta in this very important poem for the Chicano movement in the 1970s here in the U.S.
I have a question. Since this is a humanities colloquium and it's interdisciplinary by nature, and y'all are in different departments, how did you discover that you have a common interest in Murrieta, or how did you develop a common interest in Murrieta on the basis of your existing stuff?
I think we were friends and were talking about what we were going to teach, and I think I was like, I'm going to teach Life and Adventures of Joaquín Murieta, and you were like, yeah, me too, I teach that too. And so then we're like, oh, what do you say about it? It's like, oh, this is what do you say about it? And so then we're like, oh, we should do an article. And so actually we presented on this together a few times now, twice, and we do have a co-authored article in mind. So really, testifies to the humanities where there are a lot of us looking at the same thing from different angles. And I certainly couldn't do his second half of the presentation. I don't have that area of expertise, but the book kind of is the through line between our research.
Yeah, for me, I specialize in 19th century bandit narratives in Latin America, and one of the things that caught my attention about Joaquín Murieta is how much the formula, despite being a U.S. American novel, how much it does feel like a lot of the bandit narratives from Latin America. And I think that's in part what attracted me to Joaquín Murieta. And also I think it explains why this book became so popular from Mexico all the way down to Chile, right? In Latin American translations, rewritings of it. And yeah, I'll stop there. I could probably keep going, but
Yeah.
I have a question for Dr. Gore. You said that newspapers blamed the violence in the newly formed state of California on Joaquín Murieta.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any proof outside of the newspaper articles that this was a actual physical person that existed, or were they just sort of giving a name to just violence happening across the region?
I think you're exactly right. I think they were giving a name to the violence. There's a lot of oral tradition, and actually there are some scholars who argue with me that the book isn't a first edition, a first version at all. It's the corridos, the oral tradition that are circulating in Mexican and Mexican-American communities that are the original of the life and adventures of Joaquín Murieta. And I agree with that, but I think that it's copyrighted for a reason. The narrative and the labor of writing the plot and the book is a first edition, and those two things can exist simultaneously. But there's not, in 19th century California, there's so much theft going on, and the aftermath of the U.S. Mexican War, a lot of the crimes are just being blamed. And so they're just putting a name to it, and it sort of crystallizes into one person from this 5 potential people, and all these crimes happening the same day in northern and southern California. So I think you're right, they're putting a name to this violence, and it just takes off from there.
Are there any further questions? We have time for one more. Well, in that case, let's thank our speakers again. Feel free to bug them or each other about this topic or anything, and help yourselves to food and drink, please. Thank you all for coming very much. There will be more.